going on YouTube? Welcome back to another video. And in today's video, I wanted to discuss altitude. When you reach a certain altitude, it becomes that much more difficult to maintain that altitude. It becomes that much more difficult to maintain the altitude because you got people in your environment or the people around you that keep you at a much lower environment. When you build altitude and when you're someone who stays to yourself, you have freedom to be able to rise. And because you set your own expectations, you far surpass anything else anybody can really conceive. When you go back to a space of an environment that is much lower than the expectations of yourself or the altitude that you're used to, you start to come down in altitude in order to try to fit in. And when this happens, it's hard for us to maintain our form. We can't maintain our form because our form is at an altitude that is much higher than the altitude that we have been boxed in at. We have to be able to maintain our altitude. Altitude is tricky to maintain because sometimes altitude changes form, and we have to put our altitude into other outlets in order to continue progressing ourselves in what we're doing. Because at the end of the day, maybe we're not always going to be a basketball player, or we're not going to always be the one on the front lines on the basketball court, So in order to maintain our altitude, we have to oftentimes put our altitude into another outlet in order for us to maintain our form. When we don't maintain our form or we don't maintain the altitude that we're at, it becomes that much more difficult for us to rise again to that altitude when it's time to rise back to that altitude, and it could defile us. So I know in my last videos that I've spoken a lot of being able to really see and identify problems, identify your surroundings and what is going on in your environment. When you can identify what's going on in your environment, then you have a better understanding of what outlets that you can then pour yourself into. So if we don't maintain our altitude, and if we don't find the proper outlet to form ourselves into, then this could be very damaging to ourselves as a person. So then a lot of times when we look at our altitude and ourselves, we like to come down to other people's altitude because how they feel about you, because it's the discomfort to them. And the whole point is, even if it's a discomfort to them, we still have to maintain our altitude. Our job is to be able to get them to rise to the highest altitude of themselves. So we can't lower ourselves to the altitude of anybody, because then now not only are we defiling ourselves, but we're not doing our job. So that is the most important thing, is not only maintaining our altitude, but being able to maintain our altitude in the midst of uncomfortable people. That way you can encourage them or potentially encourage them to rise to the altitude that they should be on in themselves. But this is a hard process in its own, because when we rise in altitude, you have to know exactly what outlets to pour into to be the highest altitude of yourself. And if you don't understand that what that outlet is, it can be very difficult to maneuver. So this is the biggest challenge, is trying to find the right outlet in order to really pour ourselves into. What is the strategy in us for us to really express what it is that we need to be expressing. So with that being said, there's a lot of factors that come into play in terms of rising in altitude. However, we still need to do our job in maintaining ourselves and maintaining our altitude and our purpose and what we're doing in order to potentially help encourage people to figure out themselves and rise to their altitude. And this is where the mental plane comes into play. If we're not mentally strong enough, or if we're not mentally educated enough on our surroundings, not good enough at identifying problems, or not good enough at learning about our environment and learning about what are the function of tools and components and things that are in our environment. Because when we can learn about the tools and the functions of what's around us, then we know exactly what to use in order to get a certain effect out of something. But if we don't know this, if we're not reinforcing ourselves and our abilities, then there's no way that we can properly come up with the answer or solution in order for us to, navigate through our problems or our situations. So we have to be smart enough in order to figure out what it is that we need to be doing, as well as the altitude itself. See, the altitude itself that we rise to is not always enough, or it's not going to be enough in order for us to complete our goals or our vision. We have to be smart enough to see what outlets, or come up with a strategy in order to get there. What outlets can we pour into in order to be most effective in expressing that vision or tackling that goal? But anyway, I think I'm going to conclude this short video right here. I will see y'all in the next one. Hope y'all are doing good. Peace and love. We out.